Y'all waiting on me? Now you're awake. All right, good morning, everybody. Glad you are here and that we get to spend this time together studying and encouraging one another, and especially as we're about to get ready to worship together. Before we begin our class, let's start with a prayer. Lord God, we come before you and we thank you so much for this day and the opportunity that we have to worship you. We hope that you are glorified and exalted by our praise. Pray that you'll be with us as we go into this time of study. Help us to consider your word and how to share it with others. We thank you so much for Jesus. It's in his name that we pray. Amen. So we're continuing our study. We have now hit the other side of our discussion. We've been building up some arguments and thinking about how we think and reason and how the world does that as well. And so what we're going to be focusing on today is getting these specific topics and trying to understand as much as we can about the arguments being used in the midst of these main topics. And let's see if we can understand where the world's coming from and how to interject the biblical worldview into the midst of it, and how to take Scripture that speaks to the heart of man and guide the mind of man. Our topic for the day is going to be on abortion. We're going to hit it from a lot of different angles, and we're going to come at it as objectively as we possibly can, but we also want to understand where people are coming from. And so we're going to look at some objections and some statements that people may make about it. But before we get into this, I hope, as you've just been going through thinking from our class, that you have found some opportunities in life to take your stance on morals and values and ethics and apply them. Yesterday we went to the movies together. We've got family in town, and all of us loaded up and we went to the movies, and we went and watched The Lion King. And it's funny when you start thinking about different ethical decisions, it's funny how just things, even in entertainment, will come out and show some of that. And so we were watching Lion King, and there was one scene in there where Simba was trying to decide what he wanted to do, and Pumbaa was coming in and he was telling him, look, you just need to live for you. That's the most important thing. Don't worry about the circle of life. You just focus on what you need to do. Don't be concerned about everybody else. You just think about what best suits you. I thought that was just, that hit exactly what we've been discussing. But you actually find as the movie goes on, Simba actually considers everyone else. And he thinks about what would best suit not just himself, but his family. And not just those that are close to his species, but those outside of it. And it's just funny when you start thinking about different movies and pieces of entertainment or music, stuff like that, and you start digging into it, there are ethics and morals being discussed everywhere, even among the animal realm. So it's something to think about there. But that stuck out to me, and I thought I'd share that with you. Things like that, though, should illustrate for us our ethics and morals. What we've been discussing, where we were last week, we talked about what Jesus can teach us about making the right decisions. Specifically, when you go to the crux of his teaching, the Sermon on the Mount, you get this idea that he wants you to think deeper than just the actions themselves. There's more to life than just the actions. It's the heart and the mind. It's the virtues. It's values. It's everything coming together to live out God's will. It's going back to the original point of creation that we are made in the image of God. If we're made in the image of God, we're going to have concern for ourselves as well as concern for one another, because you are made in the image of God just as well as I am. And if we understand that, then we are going to have this idea of reciprocity for one another. We're going to help one another while feeding in Scripture, while feeding in truth, to determine how to best have that relationship. So Jesus comes in, he says, okay, be concerned about your quality of life, the salt, as well as the light. You've got the inward value, but you also have the external showing of it. The salt and light are these two headings over the Sermon on the Mount that then gets into these. Look, don't be focused just on, hey, I haven't murdered anybody. Have you hated someone? Have you insulted somebody? Have you degraded someone? Have you had this view of them internal that then comes out externally? Before you get to the point of murder, there are some things that you may build up that you may have been holding back. Those are just as detrimental. You may not have committed adultery, but what about all the things built up before you get to that point? Your view of relationships, your view of other people. What about those things. All of that is important for how we make ethical decisions. Jesus teaches us that by using the law, the Judaic law, building onto that with the Christian foundation of what are we about now? What should we be doing? And essentially, that's what we've been working through here with our ethical ladder. We start at the very bottom. Just when we were talking about decisions in life, you talk about, is it illegal? Well, I'm going to stay away from it. Unless I need to challenge it scripturally, then okay, we can invoke Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, and we'll go from there. But if you're just going to be making a decision, you ask, well, okay, what is the legality of it? But then, what about me? What are things that I prize? What are some values that I want to hold on to and I don't want to violate those or compromise those? Can you make statements of things I will never do? Then you start thinking about your relationship to others and you think about the oughtness of a situation. What must I do? And even challenge yourself a little bit further. What if everyone did this? What if everyone took the same stance that I take? But then the top rung, which is always what we're trying to build up to, we're getting to that point. You kind of have to stair step, especially when you're dealing with people, because they're going to look at the law. They're going to look at values and virtues because that's something that we prize in humanity and society, and then we function within, those realms with one another. But where we're trying to get to is, what does God have to say about this? Because that's going to trump everything else. That's actually going to decide everything on the lower rung because we're trying to get to this top point. So what does God have to say about it, and how do we respond through natural law, things that He has written on our hearts about morals? How do we piece all this together? So this is our ladder. This is how we are making decisions. This is all building up to where we are today. So let's ask a question, and let's talk just a little bit broadly, and we'll narrow it down as we go through. What is the value of life? Now, you know where our topic's going. We're talking about abortion, but let's set that to the side just for a moment, and let's just talk generally, because this is actually going to apply to some other topics we're going to be dealing with. What is the value of life? How do you respond to that? How does the world respond to it? We'll take criticisms or support for it. What do you think the value of life is? And how do we determine it? How do others determine the value of life? Okay, you can't put a price tag on the value of life. Why? Okay. Okay, we're made in His image. God gave it to us. There is no price tag on it. George, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, Christ's single life paid a ransom for all.
Okay.
So there's a value of one life.
Okay, so the value of one life is that Jesus gave His life for all, and so we can kind of see how that played out. Okay, what else? Okay, so looking at hazard pay, that in a particular job setting that more money may be paid out because of the hazardous situation that somebody may subject themselves to in a job, and you can kind of see that benefit and payout of them in the midst of that hazardous situation. Okay? Jim? Okay, so according to Acts chapter 10, Peter and Cornelius, Peter gets that teaching from God that, God is not partial. He sees the value of life all around, and not to be a respecter of persons is what gets taught there. And many other passages as well deal with that same thing. Okay, what else? So you look at the actions of some individuals that they don't see any value in another life because they take other people's lives as if it were a game. But you consider the rationalization in that, though, of how can you rationalize that? Is it really that they don't value other people's lives, or they value their own lives more than theirs, or they just gloss it over and they don't even want to think about, is there something broken? I mean, you start thinking through all of that, but how can people just take other people's lives and not calculate all the things that we're kind of building onto? Yeah.
Only God can make or give life. Man can do a lot of things with the elements that God put in God alone can give life.
Okay, so there is only one person that gives life. So far, no one has been able to create life that, aside from God. Man does not do that. Man takes away life, but God creates it.
Once you bring a life into existence, unless you're talking about something with animal kingdom, you brought a soul into existence. Jesus said, what is it profit man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? He put a price tag on it that isn't even enough. The whole world, everything physical, is not worth one single soul. So God placed that value on each and every life that comes into existence. You don't get to make that decision. He's already.
So God gives the value to life by putting a soul within them. And you look at his teachings of, gaining the world and losing your soul. He puts a big price tag on what's valuable and what's important. Now let's think for a moment and shift it just slightly. Outside of our Christian worldview, going into the world, what do people see as the value of life? Or how do they rationalize it, or how do they just see who we are and what we do? We see it, okay, it comes from God, and I get that. That's within the world, the biblical worldview in our context. But outside of that, what are people saying? Is there any value of life?
I think, if I understood what Chris was saying, I think one of the issues that we have is that people put, and Jeremy, I guess, kind of goes along with what he's saying. People, we have a segment or we have people in our society who place more value on things, and sometimes not even important things, more than life. I mean, they'll take a life to have to get something that is, well, in the first place is going to expire or go away. But in a lot of cases, we see people who are murdered for a piece of clothing, or something like that, as small as that.
So yeah, you see people killing just for material sake. They put more value for stuff. They pursue stuff. And it's actually exactly what James says in James chapter 4. If you start in verse 1, he asks the question, he says, what causes fights and what causes quarrels among you? Is it not that your passions are at war within you? So why do you steal? Why do you kill? It's because you want those things, you desire those things more than other people or the higher purpose, which is God. And that's exactly what James deals with in James chapter 4 in those first few verses there, which is why he says, you pursue God and you flee from Satan. You pursue that which is good versus that which is carnal, which is detrimental to us, those desires that are out of context. Go back to James chapter 1. How and why are we tempted? We are tempted when we are lured and enticed by our what? Desires. Eventually that gives birth to sin. Yeah. Say that again. So yeah, you look. All right, so you look back over history, and there are a lot of people that put different levels of value. They put their life as a higher value over others. And so look at some of these, Stalin and people along those lines of how did they justify what they were doing? Putting a higher value on themselves versus other people. So how do you bring that back into balance? How do you see all life as valuable? Isn't that what our laws should be about? But in some foundation, that's what they're trying to encapsulate. And here's an example. A lot of our debates on a lot of the ethical and moral decisions and legislation of many of those has to deal with the 14th Amendment. And I've got it up there fully, and you may not be able to read it, so I'll just read it. And then tell me what sticks out to you, or what kind of arguments are being based on this. All persons, born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So what is our world saying about this? Or what are some statements in here that stick out to you? Not just for our discussion of thinking about abortion, that's definitely going to come out of this, but just in general, what is being said? What's the dialogue surrounding this amendment? What's its purpose in its creation, and what's its application? Okay, so it was in conjunction with 13 and 15 as well, dealing with slavery. So in its original context, that was one of the sparks of it. Okay?
It was dealing with the definition of person to a large extent too, because before that, people would say that certain people were not people. So it was trying to redefine the word person to include everything.
Okay. The definition of a person. That's one of the reasons behind it, of trying to determine what is a person and what rights do they have, what privileges can they receive, specifically here in the United States, but just, that can span out a little bit bigger of why would we even say that people have rights, or why that personhood matters. Okay, so that's definitely part of it. Understand that definition of what constitutes a person. Okay, very good. We're going to see more of that come out. What else? Okay, due process. There is a process, there is a standard, there's a way to get to that conclusion. And shoring that up, making sure that everyone is given that privilege and that right. Okay? Anything else stick out to you? How is this being used in our world today?
Well, it says born or naturalized. It doesn't include those conceived, born, or naturalized in the United States.
Okay, so looking at those that are born or naturalized in the United States, there's a lot of discussion going on those two terms. Okay, what else? Say that again, sorry. Okay, so the last clause is what's being used to support the liberal agenda, the equal protection of the laws. Deny to any person within this jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. It's being used. People are discussing these things. Okay. In context to our discussion for the day, thinking about abortion, how is our world justifying and rationalizing their decision to terminate a pregnancy? All right, we're going to go all over the place with this, and we're going to try and understand the scriptures as well as what people are saying and what are they going through, because we need to be effective in teaching. There's a lot of things that come to my mind. Before we go to the next slide, the other day, Shelby and I were driving down Madison Avenue, and right over there, right next to McDonald's, as Madison Avenue begins, there's a trailer that gets set up. It's a mobile clinic. It's actually one of our local doctors that he sets that up himself. That's something that he does on a volunteer basis to offer chance for people that are pregnant to come in and to receive, care, but also to be able to, get ultrasounds, to be able to see, hear the life that's within them. That I love that because, his mentality, being a religious man, that he says that's what I want people to see. That what is within them when they are pregnant, that it is a life. And this is where the discussion is going to come from, is what are people saying about that? Is it just a lump of cells within an individual, or is there something more there? And what we see in the 14th Amendment, does it apply to them? So I want to have that in our mind, and I want to go a little bit deeper just to where we are right now, thinking about abortion and law. As we're going up that rung, we need to understand where we are and what people are saying. It's illegal for states to completely prohibit abortion. We're going to get into these major cases of what sparked that and why are we in the state that we are today. But this is where we are. It's legal for a woman to have an abortion for any reason deemed a health issue. Go back to our little survey that we did at the beginning of this class. When I ask, is abortion wrong in every situation? We feel a little bit of a tug because we have to start thinking, well, what about when there's a health complication? What if there is, something going on that, is it the life of the mom or the life of the baby? There are medical cases and there are things that happen in situations, sadly, that do come up. But looking at the state of the laws and things that are in place today, we can look at these two things, and this is kind of where stuff is. But we need to be thinking through it. We've got to think, what are people seeing? What are they experiencing? How can we meet them where they are? All right, so 3 major cases, and you're probably very familiar with this first one, Roe versus Wade. Short synopsis. What is the conclusion of Roe versus Wade? What came out of this? Say that again. Okay, the right to privacy includes the right to abortion. What else? Some other things that you may notice in there. It argued that the 14th Amendment's right to privacy should include the womb itself. Abortions during the first trimester were allowed. After the first trimester, states were allowed to decide for themselves. After viability, the point at which the fetus can live on its own outside the womb, 24 to 26 weeks, the state was allowed to prohibit except in the case of medical emergency. I would encourage you to go back and read some of these cases a little bit more thoroughly to see what was going on. We know about Roe versus Wade. That's one that pops up a lot that we should be familiar with. But there was another one that actually happened the same day, Doe versus Bolton, which happened in Georgia. And I'm going through my notes and I'll pull it up. So before this case happened, here's what Georgia had in place. The Georgia law in question, which they wanted to contest, was this, that there were certain restrictions about who was allowed to have an abortion and why. And here's some things, allow me to read this. See, other restrictions included the requirement that the procedure be approved in writing by 3 physicians and by 3-member special committee that either 1, continued pregnancy would endanger the pregnant woman's life or seriously and permanently injure her health. Number 2, the fetus would very likely be born with a grave, permanent, mental or physical defect. Number 3, the pregnancy resulted from rape or incest. In addition, only Georgia residents could receive abortions under this statutory scheme. So the case that came out, they were saying, all right, those are the parameters and the restrictions that are in place for abortion. So Doe, she comes in and she says, that's unconstitutional, that you would have to have all these restrictions, and wanted to have that overturned. So there's one of the cases. Like I said, I would encourage you to read into these a little bit more. I pulled in a bunch of different notes on it. Let's see. Yeah. So Chris was saying that, having done some research in the 90s on this, that looking at the number of abortions at that time, and then how many of them were actually, in the United States and worldwide, as what was documented, how many of them, what's the percentage of those that were health complications? You said 6% of that number, or those that were based off of rape or incest, that it was 1% or less in the 90s. Now, I don't have the data in front of me, and I didn't pull it for the sake of this class, but that's something that you think about, is that, okay, well, there's such a small number of those, which is the case, but we're still basing, the value of life. How do you get people to see that? How do you get people that are rationalizing whatever their decision? They say, well, we should be given this privilege because it's our bodies. We want to decide what to do with it. How do you take that information and be able to teach them when it is an emotional situation? People are using emotions to justify it on one way and using emotions on the other. How do we bring that into balance? There's just so many things that it makes me think of. But, looking at these cases, you got Roe versus Wade, Doe versus Bolton, that happened in Georgia on the same day. And then the last one is Planned Parenthood versus Casey. This was another one that stuck out to me. Let's see. So the Supreme Court ruled that abortion rights are consistent with ideals of personal autonomy. So the right to make one's own decisions and bodily integrity, the right that one has over their own body, and that they can be left alone and decide what they need to. And so that was another one that came out. Let's see. Yeah. So people that are struggling with, if they have an abortion that was health complications. Now, I don't know, breaking that percentage down further, and if somebody pulls it up, I gladly receive it, I don't even know how many of them would be marked down of if they were going to have a child that had complications, deciding, well, it'd be better for me to terminate that child's life than for them to be born impaired, or the length of their days might be shorter because of that impairment. From our view, we say, well, we're going to turn that over to God's hands. We're going to ask for His health and His strength in that. So there would be some selfish part of it of, I don't want to carry that burden for, my life to have to take care of that child, hands-on 24/7. And that's with an impairment, but people are saying the same thing with a healthy baby of not wanting to be responsible for that. Okay, so you said Indiana. There's some discussions going on about, and this is part of it, is making aborting for race or gender and being biased that way. If you come in and say, well, there's health complications, things like that, that goes one path. But what if somebody says, well, I just really wanted a boy. I just really, I maybe, and this went genetics, and we didn't even put this one on here, and I debated, and we might actually go that way of looking at some of the genetic arguments that we're having, that our world's having about what kind of procedures can we do genetically, and how ethical can we be with those. I might actually pull in that class of looking at that information, but that's where they're going to. They're saying, all right, we can perform these tests in the womb that you can determine, even all the way down genetically what this child is going to be predisposed with, and making an abortion based off of that decision of, they might have a genetic complication, or it may not be the genetics that I want.
This is just some numbers from a cross-section that happened in Florida in 2018. Incestuous relationships, 0.01%. The woman was raped, 0.14%. The woman's life was endangered, 0.27%. Serious fetal abnormality is 1%. So you're at less than 1% on most of those in Florida in 2018, if that represents at all what's happening.
Okay, so looking at I appreciate you pulling up those, Jeremy, that looking in 2018, the state of Florida alone, their abortions, the percentage of those that were based off of rape, incest, and just complications in general, the aggregate of those, less than 1%, 1% all the way up to maybe 2% on extreme cases. Just for the state of Florida alone, you share that over the remainder of the other states, and you probably have a good average of the small percentage that are based on, rape, incest, and major complications documented. So, those are things to look at, and that's what we need to be talking about. Caleb, yeah. So what Caleb was saying, to condense that down, is that, looking at logically what people are saying about a child in the womb, can you make the same case for a 2-year-old? And looking at some cases throughout the UK of someone that she was told that her baby was going to be born healthy, it was born with Down syndrome, and she said, had I known at that time, I would have aborted. And looking at, things that come out like that. And that actually is going to go to the next part of our discussion, and we'll continue on, sorry. That thing about personhood and what is being said about it. And I've got a couple of points just for us to consider about how do you use, or what people are doing to use the 14th Amendment, and how do you determine what personhood is. One of them is on vitality. The point at which the fetus is able to live on its own outside the womb. And that's what's being said. All right, this child is viable at this number of weeks. Now, I've already got the problem that's up there, and you can see it, and we could take it even further, but determining when a child is viable. I know just within, this room, our connections with other people, looking at premature births and looking at that number, and, really what science is able to do to be able to take care and nurture a life, even if it was born early. You look at vitality, what determines vitality? Is it just the number of weeks, the gestational number of weeks, and what is being formed at that time? That's part of it. As the child is developing its organs that it needs to live, and it needs sustenance and particular things from the mother as it is growing. But when is it viable? When could it be born and be sustained on its own through medical care? What is that number? Is it a number of weeks? Is it a process? What is it? But as people are trying to determine personhood, well, maybe it's based on vitality. When is the child able to live outside the womb? But then part of this would depend on medical texts and not the baby. Another thing would be brain development. At 2 weeks, brain activity can be detected. Medical death is defined by the cessation of brain activity. Medical life should be defined by activation. So, when is a person dead? At what point are they actually constituted as dead? Well, it's the cessation of brain activity, when it stops. So could the argument be that when the brain activity starts, that's when life begins? And I like this, and I borrowed this from a friend that presented on this, and he talked about pre-activity brains are not dead, they're developing. Dead brains don't develop. I thought that was really good. They're trying to document when does brain activity begin, but you got to get to that point. And the development, I think a lot can be said there. There's some good things. Yeah. You think about when the soul enters an individual. And, even within the theological realm, and we won't for the sake of discussion today, but when does the soul enter the body? Is it at conception? How far in? There's discussions on that, but something that you do think about is that God gives life, and that he does take care of it in the womb and beyond. And passages that we'll be able to pull out on that, but there's a consolation there, is what Bill was saying. But just still thinking about what people are arguing or what they're looking at. Maybe another part of it is sentience, self-consciousness, and the ability to feel. So the problem, you would reverse that and say, well, does a person lose rights while in a coma? If they're determined, the personhood is determined when they feel and they're conscious about themselves. When do you even get to put that on a chart? When do you determine that? Maybe that their personhood begins at the point of birth. Not many people are going to say this. A fetus is the same a few minutes before the birth as it is immediately after. But you look at like what New York and some other states, what they're talking about. It's just sad how far people are willing to go. But I guess for our discussion today, what I'm trying to determine is how do they justify that rationally, and how can we help them where they are to get them where they need to be? How can we walk them up the ladder? I hope that you're seeing some of this come out of. It's not just what is legal. We're in a state, we're in a situation where things are the way that they are. We want people to be Christians. We want people to see eternity and their life on that way. Some are not there yet. Some are in a very emotional situation, and facts are important. but we also need to be able to discuss with them and get them to where they need to be. We've got to walk them up the ladder. We've got to be able to show them what this is all about. And it does come to, I think, strong point here is conception. From conception, an embryo already has a unique and separate genetic identity. Scientifically speaking, embryos aren't potential people. They're the first stage of the growth cycle of humans. You can get as far into genetics as you want to and think about that, but from conception, the formation of an individual, regardless of what you want to say with the soul or anything like that, we're talking to people, something can be said there about this developmental stage, what is being created. Let's go a little bit further before we run out of time, and we'll pick up next week. But I want to continue looking at what people are saying. So here's some things that come out. A woman has the right to do what she wants with her body. Abortions will happen, even if illegal. It's safer to make it legal so it can be regulated. Unwanted pregnancies create overwhelming financial hardship. We should not force unwanted children onto unprepared parents. Society should not force women to bring severely handicapped children into the world. Society should not force women sexually assaulted to continue their pregnancies. So here are things that people are saying. What sticks out to you, and what's a proper response? Pick any one of them. I mean, we could spend an entire class on each individual one, but what do you see and what do you think?
They all have one thing in common: selfishness to the self over the child. I mean, look at this. A woman has the right to do what she wants with her body. Her body is not hers. It's being rented out from God to use on the earth. Abortion will happen if it's illegal. If it's illegal, so it's safer to make it legal so it can be regulated. Safer does not mean it would be impossible if it was illegal. Unwanted pregnancies create overwhelming financial hardship. For that sort of thing to happen, the parents had to know what was going on before it started.
So a lot of, kind of boiling these down, what's consistent through there, a lot of it is selfish in nature, okay? What else? Inconvenience.
The thing I noticed is that the attitude is that this child was forced or put upon this person, without not wanting. There's no consideration for the action that brought them to this point. I mean, they didn't restrict their activity to avoid the things that they're trying to avoid here.
Yeah. The inconvenience factor of, just that's being imposed on me. Well, there's some decisions that go into place of how this happens biologically. And so thinking about things there. But there are also, we get things that are outside of that control. And I don't want to just put a spin on it that way, because there are some that are outside of control. But a lot of the responses here, what we're dealing with, is people acting like that was not their decision. I don't know.
A lot of these stem from a lack of support, which stems from the fact that in society we've broken down from rely upon your family, communities, and church, instead of rely upon the employees. And so they're not getting support because they don't want to rely on church, rely on family, rely on community. And that's mostly stems from that.
Okay, so looking at support, a lot of these, if they would just have the church to help them, encourage them to get through some of these situations, I think that's right. I say it all the time. I don't know where we would be without the church. Real quick, the bell's about to ring. Something that George said that I wanted to give this illustration, and I'm going to put a pause here before we get too far in, because the bell's about to ring, and we'll pick up next week. And I intended probably for this to go on as well, and we'll add to it. But allow me to give you this illustration to go off of what you were saying. Judith Jarvis Thompson, she makes this illustration, so allow me to read this. She compares a woman with an unwanted pregnancy to a person who has been kidnapped in order to provide a life-saving blood transfusion to a world-renowned violinist. The violinist is dying, and the person providing the transfusion is essential to the violinist being able to continue living. Even though the violinist will die if the person unplugs from the transfusion, Thompson argues that there is no moral obligation for the kidnapped person to continue to provide this life-saving service. She then argues that the woman with an unwanted pregnancy has essentially been kidnapped by the fetus and forced to provide a life-saving service by continuing the pregnancy. She concludes that the pregnant woman has no obligation to save the fetus's life and is morally justified in ending her pregnancy, even though it would result in the death of the fetus. That is, even though the fetus may die, the pregnant woman has no duty to provide aid, in the same way that the person attached to the violinist has no duty to provide aid, even though the violinist will die if the aid is not provided. People will say a lot of things, and our world is struggling not just understanding morals, but understanding the larger scheme of things altogether. And I want to put a plug there and a pin in that, and let's use that as our discussion for next week, as we're going to get into what I'm going to call top-rung discussions. What does Scripture have to say about this? How do we come back to where we need to be? So that's what I've got. I don't think I heard the bell, but we'll let it go. So there's that. All right, we'll be done for the day. So I think the bell was supposed to ring.